stunning in discus. You know, you've represented South Africa at the highest level. What are those everyday obstacles that you've had to face in order and overcome to become the best?
So I think when we look at everyday barriers, we can break it down into three broad groups. We can look at physical barriers, and then we can look at personal barriers, and then we can look at social and cultural barriers. Especially when you look at these barriers from a physically disability point of view, and added to that women in sport. When you look at physical barriers, just a normal thing like lack of transport. So how do you get from your house to your facility? Because a lot of women in Africa don't drive, to start off with. And then when you have a physical disability, it's even more difficult to get onto that public transport, because a lot of the taxis will just drive past them. They won't even stop, because the wheelchair, it's extra time, it's extra space, it's one person less, so the perception is there that it will cost the driver time and money. So just getting that person into transport to get to a facility is already a barrier. And then women tend to earn less than men do, so the lack of money. I'm not talking about funding, I'm just talking about pure lack of your economic place in the world. And if you earn a salary, then you tend to spend more on your children, because we do have a lot of single households out there where the mothers tend to have to put their hands deeper in their pockets than the fathers. So there you already have an extra expense that men don't necessarily have to look at. Then personal safety. So if you are an everyday wheelchair user, or a person with a prosthetic limb that's maybe above the knee, you already have that extra dimension of you're more vulnerable. So added to that you have to now use public transport and it's getting late and you can't get onto that, it makes it also even more difficult. And then we get to funding. People tend to not want to fund people with disabilities, as they don't tend to want to fund people, women in sport. So when we look at funding, it's not only the big things, the World Cups, the nationals. We're just looking at individual level, where your company can maybe just add 5,000 Rand a month to a person with disability. That will make such a big impact versus just focusing on the bigger sporting events and tournaments. Sorry, I have a lot to say on this.
Please, no, educate us. This is good.
And
this
then,
is good.
in terms of the cost of equipment, because now if you are a person with a physical disability, you already have an extra cost. So if you look at, for instance, a prosthetic limb, it might not be the same limb that you use in your day-to-day. So if you're a runner, you have to invest in a running foot, which is an extra cost. If you are a wheelchair user and you are doing track, you have to have a wheelchair that's specifically designed for track. If you do cycling, it's a wheelchair for cycling, which is an enormous cost layout that it's already on top of the fact that you don't get funding. And then your everyday mobility aids that goes with it. And then in terms of personal barriers, people with disabilities, especially women, already have a bit of a setback in terms of their body image. And now you are expecting women to go and compete in situations where people might not understand what is happening in terms of your associated physiological needs if you are in, for instance, in a wheelchair. If you have a spinal cord injury, the needs that you have is different to somebody else that has got fully functioning body with them. So how do you schedule, for instance, just a toilet break if you're a swimmer? Because it's the implication that goes with it. And then a lot of women already feel a bit shy to speak about this, and now you have to stand and voice it and say, listen, I can practice, but we have to schedule my toilet breaks a bit better, because that will have an influence. Or if you play wheelchair basketball or tennis, and you have a spinal cord injury, how do you put all of the extra expectations of your physiological limitations within that space as well? And then clothing and equipment. I don't know if you saw the tweet where in America there was this person that just said, why do we need clothing for people with disabilities? How inclusive are we going to get? This is getting ridiculous. But if you think about it, the need is different to somebody that's got a fully functioning body. And because the niche is so much smaller, it tends to be so much more expensive. So where you would pay normally for your sporting equipment, say as an able-bodied person, it might cost you 5,000 Rand. As a person with a disability, you have that extra equipment, and you now have to look at how is my clothes designed? Where does the seam sit? Does it rise higher in the back? Can I do it with, if I have limited mobility in my upper limbs, how do I dress and undress and still compete without expending so much energy just on getting dressed? And then thirdly, looking at your parental and cultural influences when you grow up, what do people say to you as a person with a disability? What is your capability? So people don't understand how much impact extra voices can have on the ability for women in sports with physical disabilities to compete. And then before you take over, the last thing is the social and cultural barriers that we face, because traditionally sport has been a very male-dominated arena, and which now leaves a less than safe space for women. And tack onto that the perception that a lot of people have about people with physical disabilities, which then just leaves you open for a greater opportunity for bullying, because a lot of times people with physical disabilities are seen less than, which is not the case at all. Just the mere fact that they are there and they're showing up and they're taking part should tell you that they've got much more grit than expected. And then with that comes that attitude of physical and probably sexual abuse, because once again the perception is there that women in sport will keep quiet because we're all raised to be proper women and just smile and say yes and thank you. And if you add on top of that the fact that you have a physical disability and people already tell you in society, but you are different. So where does that leave you in terms of that victimization?
If you're different, who will listen? Who will listen to you?
Exactly.
That is a harrowing account that you have just given us. I think it's an eye-opener for everybody here today, and